Every journey begins with a single step. For our friend, the hydrogen atom, that step is a bold leap from being part of a water molecule to an emissary of energy. In the heart of an electrolysis chamber, powered by renewable energy, water is transformed. Oxygen steps back, releasing the vibrant hydrogen atom. Alone, hydrogen is volatile, but when paired with captured CO2 and the help of a touch of alchemy, together, they forge a potent synthetic fuel. A new energy carrier, clean, efficient, ready to power our world. Innovative companies are investing in the production of eFuels, which can then be distributed via the existing infrastructure to industry and consumers, providing them with a climate-friendly alternative to conventional fossil fuels. Aviation, maritime, heavy goods transport, even your car, eFuels power a wide range of sectors and offer a sustainable solution to our diverse energy and mobility needs. We at the eFuel Alliance embrace the entire value chain and give it a face and a voice. Our goal is political acceptance and regulatory consideration of eFuels as a significant contribution to sustainable climate protection. In the quest for green energy, eFuels are an essential piece of the puzzle, linking today's infrastructure to a more sustainable future. The eFuel Alliance is powering this transition, forging a path from hydrogen to hope, because the future of energy is now.
Thanks a lot, Jan, and warm welcome from my side. My name is Tobias. I'm responsible for content and strategy within the eFuel Alliance, and I'm honored to present you a new study that we have conducted in-house with our members, with our experts, about the comparison of production rules for hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives, so-called eFuels. I will now share my screen, and Jan, I hope you can see everything.
Yes, it's working.
Before we jump into our analysis, I would like to give you an overview where we are with eFuels right now. It is right, eFuels are not there yet. Most eFuel quotas are MBO quotas, so quotas for renewable fuels of non-biological origin, are there in 2030. It's in the Renewable Energy Directive. There are objectives in the refuel aviation and also outside of Europe. Many mandates for aviation, but also road sector exist. So we have right now not a lot of announcements. This is showing you that the industry is ready. Together with Porsche Consulting, we are tracking as eFuel Alliance all announcements. We have identified more than 300 projects currently with an announced potential production capacity of 20 billion liter gasoline equivalent. It is clear that we won't reach that capacity in 2030, but it shows you high interest, and many of these projects, we just consider the most serious ones, which are frequently updating their information. They all want to reach final investment decisions soon. We are just considering here 6 different types of eFuels, which I will show you in one of the next slides, and just the transport sector. We have excluded, for example, ammonia for the industry sector. Of course, that's a quite sharp growth rate, because we are basically coming from a zero production, or just a few pilot plants existing right now. In this study, we are also looking at who is producing what. And I think it's an interesting overview here, that 4 of the 5 biggest producers or potential producers are coming already from China. China is really stepping in. Probably you have heard about the cooperation between the shipping company Maersk and Goldwind to produce synthetic methanol. There are also other production planned in China at the moment, and I think Europe has to make better regulation if we not want to lose the next industry to China. Most of the projects are following the methanol route. Methanol is a quite promising future energy carrier, can be used in the shipping sector. A lot of ships are ordered to be dual fueled, so either methanol or conventional fuel. In addition, methanol can be further converted to diesel, to gasoline, but also can mix by to usual gasoline blends. In future, the certification is not there yet, but also in future, we are expecting that the methanol to kerosene route, so the use of e-fuels in the aviation sector, will be certified soon. But there are also other projects following Fischer-Tropsch routes, producing a mix of hydrocarbons, so a mix of gasoline, diesel, and kerosene. And some projects have announced to use methanation, for example, in LNG ships or LNG trucks. But as already said, this could lead to up to 20 billion liters of e-fuels globally in 2030, which would mean a calculated revenue of up to 100 billion euro. So quite an important market where a lot of investors would like to participate. However, the calculated required investment volume with 550 billion euro is also quite impressive. But we are not there yet. This is a long way to go. Here you can see that just a small portion of these announcements have reached final investment decision and or are in construction or already in operation. This means for us as eFuel Alliance that something is not right, that something is going in the wrong direction. A lot of projects are not reaching that stage and are somewhere in the concept, in the feasibility phase. Already for the feed engineering, you need a lot of money, you need first investments, we as eFuel Alliance are committed to improve the political framework for these projects, that we will in future hopefully have a higher share of final investment decision and therefore more availability of e-fuels. For us, the political framework is one of the key challenges. I will not mention all of this today. We will soon dive in the production criteria for hydrogen and e-fuels. But from our perspective, three main challenges exist at the moment. It's relatively low quotas for RFNBOs in Europe in the Renewable Energy Directive. The European Commission or the European Union has agreed on just 1% RFNBOs for the transport sector in 2030. And the energetic quota got introduced as well. For that reason, we have a double counting of RFNBOs. So in reality, it's just 0.5% of the fuel consumption in 2030. Luckily, and this makes me quite optimistic, we see more and more member states increasing the RFNBO target in the national implementation of the RED. For example, Finland is going to 4% RFNBOs just for the road sector, so demand for aviation and maritime comes on top. Last week on Friday, we have seen a publication from Spain that they also want to go to 2.5% RFNBOs in 2030, and in addition 1.5% of RFNBOs or green hydrogen in refineries. In total, we now have drafts, consultations, and also already legal text from 12 member states in the European Union. And altogether, we see a potential demand already of up to 40 terawatt hours of RFMBOs in 2030. Not all of this is in law yet, but you see there will be a demand, and in combination with high penalties, it hopefully will lead to realizing the projects and getting from announcements to reality. Second challenge we have, and this is our topic today, are the delegated acts, which from our perspective are much too restrictive for an early market phase. And third one, and this is a controversial topic, is the exclusion of the road sector. We have a ridiculous debate about that e-fuels should only be used in hard to abate sectors. Unfortunately, this is quite a small niche. It's in international competition. It has low willingness of pay, and we think we could achieve much more if we stay agnostic, if we also address, for example, a huge legacy fleet of the road sector of 1.5 billion vehicles with an internal combustion engine, and that we can scale up the market much faster if we avoid this ideological discussion about hard to abate sectors. But let's dive in our comparison of production rules. We at the beginning of the year, we got the task from one of our members to compare the production rules in the European Union, United Kingdom, and in the US. We have done this and we have published this paper. You will find the paper on our webpage, and I'm sure Jan has already also posted the link in the chat. I forgot. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions. After my presentation, we will have some input from practice from one of our members. David from Infinium will present their experiences with the delegated acts. And afterwards, we want to have a Q&A with you. So please, if you have questions, post them in the Q&A box. You find them at the bottom of your screen. So in the paper, we have analyzed key parameters like the eligible electricity sources, different CO2 reduction thresholds, temporal as well as geographical correlation, CO2 sourcing, which is important if you not just want to produce green hydrogen, but also derivatives in the end, then the possibility to use CCS. And of course, it's quite detailed and there are a lot of nitty-gritty things in the regulations. It comes with a lot of exemptions and flexibilities. So it was a lot of work to analyze this. In addition, at the end of this paper, you will find short descriptions of the three certifying companies which got approved by the European Commission. It is RedCert, ISCC, and CertiHigh. And we try to give an overview about and have linked their official documents so you see what you have to hand in if you want to get an RFMBO certification in Europe, and also what it costs and what the differences in the processes and other stuff is. Just as a short reminder, what we are talking about here with the example of the current rules in the European Union. If you want to produce green hydrogen or renewable e-fuels, you are not allowed to use any electricity for the production. You have to make sure that the electricity comes from new installations, which are not older than 36 months before the electrolysis got into operation, that the renewable electricity installation has not received any financial aid. There is a grandfathering for the additionality. If you get into operation before 2028, then you are exempted for 10 years to meet the additionality criteria. Or if you are in a country with a carbon intensity of the electricity grid of below 18 gram CO2 per megajoule, like in France, for example, or in Sweden, then you don't need to meet the additionality at the moment. In addition, in Europe, you have to fulfill the temporal correlation. We have a monthly basis, so the electricity generation and the electricity consumption need to be balanced within a month. After 2030, and there will be an official review in July 2028, it will be hourly. This is not the case if the electricity price in a bidding zone is below 20 euro per megawatt hours or 0.36 times higher than the current ETS price. In addition, you need to make sure that you are in the right geographical zone. So just the same bidding zone is allowed. This is especially difficult if you are in countries with separated bidding zones, for example, Italy or Sweden. There you need to make sure that the installation, so the generation of renewable electricity and the consumption is in the same bidding zone. All of this, of course, if you want to meet it, is increasing the production costs. There are independent studies around, for example, from the European Court of Auditors, and you will find it linked in the document, that the temporal correlation alone is increasing the hydrogen production cost by 35 up to 35%. There are also letters, for example, from the former German economy minister Robert Habeck, mentioning that the delegated acts are increasing the hydrogen production cost by 2.4 euro per kilogram. And of course, this is a lot, especially in the beginning, where the willingness to pay is low, where we have high production costs because we have not gained any reductions to economy of scale. And we think we need a different approach to start with. The CO2 sources in Europe are, of course, also regulated. Actually, the whole technology is treated as it would be a matured technology, which is already in place and available. So just direct air capturing from the ambient air is allowed, biogenic sources, and here you need to make sure that the biomass fulfill all sustainability criteria, which are mentioned in Annex 5 of the RED. Industrial point sources are only allowed until 2041, and if it comes from electricity generation, just until 2036. Here we are criticizing that it's not differentiating between avoidable and unavoidable industrial CO2 sources. We will have in future process-related CO2 sources from industries like cement, clinker, steel, which cannot be avoided. Even if you're using 100% renewable energy, if you break up the limestone, there will be CO2. So we urge the Commission to change this approach, and we'll soon publish a study which is mapping in Europe where we have avoidable and where we have unavoidable CO2 sources. And we hope that we can contribute to a fact-based discussion about eligible CO2 point sources here. When we now compare this to the UK and to the US, we see a lot of differences. And of course, this makes it not easy for e-fuel producers to decide where to produce and where to sell the e-fuels in the end. So in the UK, for example, you need to achieve CO2 reduction of 65%. In Europe, it is 70%. In the United States, you have a different approach. Here, the carbon footprint is calculated via a life cycle tool called GREET model, and you get different tax incentives depending on the carbon footprint that you have in the end, of up to $3 per kilogram of hydrogen. And so here, all emissions of the life cycle are included. When it comes to the state aid, so if the renewable electricity generation plant has received any public money. Europe is most strict. It's not allowed to receive any money, and if the installation has received money, you need to pay it back. The UK is more flexible here. Also, renewable electricity installations from curtailment and other grid services can be used. For example, carbon cost for differences are acceptable for the renewable electricity generation. And the US is the most pragmatic one. Here, all subsidized electricity is used. This lead, for example, if you want to produce in the US, if you want to get the incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act for your green hydrogen, you need to find a renewable electricity installation which has not received funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, which is quite curious. And I don't know why, as a European citizen, for example, we are not allowed to benefit from US tax money payers for the generation of renewable electricity. However, the additionality, other regions have taken example on Europe. Europe were first, and we have discussed the delegated acts for years now. It was first mentioned in summer 2018. I think I wrote my first position paper in 2020 about that. It had a lot of delay. Originally, the Commission had to publish something by end of 2021. Finally, in summer last year, we got the final document, and the certifier got approved end of last year. So this is how long such a process can take. But other regions have taken an example here. Also, in the United States, additionality means that the electricity plant is not older than 36 months than the RFNBO plant. There are some exemptions. For example, in the US, old nuclear power plants are allowed to be used. UK and Europe are just focusing on renewable electricity. In the US, you are also allowed to use electricity from biomass or combustion of biomass, and also from nuclear power, for example. In the United Kingdom, it's not further specified. Maybe David later has some details here for us. I just mentioned that it need to be at the same time. Here, I think we still need to figure out what that means. When it comes to temporal correlation, the EU is second most ambitious one. We have a monthly correlation, as already mentioned, until 2030. In the US, you just have an annual correlation until 2030 and an hourly from 2030 onwards. In the United Kingdom, you need to provide 30 minutes alignment, but you can also use averages from the grid, which can be aggregated over the whole year. When it comes to geographical correlation, in Europe, you're just allowed to use the same bidding zone, or if in the neighboring bidding zone, the day-ahead market price is higher than in the bidding zone where you want to produce the RFNBO. In UK, all neighboring grids are eligible if there is no systematic grid congestion. In the US, it's just a simple book and claim. If you can show, then it's not a problem to use neighboring grids. At least this is what we have analyzed from reading the documents. The CO2 sourcing, and I think this is an important point. As mentioned, Europe is banning industrial point sources, and these industrial point sources need to be in an effective carbon pricing, which does not exist outside of Europe, which is killing at the moment all eFuel projects with industrial point sources outside of Europe, because there's no ETS comparable system in place. And I'm sure David will have a good example for that later. And UK and US are much more pragmatic. And for that reason, some e-fuel producers might prefer these markets. Here you can use fossil-based industry sources. You can, in the US, you can even use CO2 from power plants, which might switch in future to bioenergy as well. And we would really recommend to take a more differentiated approach here when it comes to CO2 sourcing, because it's much easier to get concentrated CO2 from these point sources than direct air capturing, which is not in a technology stage to produce e-fuels at the moment. CCS is possible in all regions with different requirements. Yesterday, we have finally got the delegated act, so the production rules for low carbon hydrogen, for blue hydrogen, or red hydrogen if you want to produce with nuclear power. There's also a chapter about CCS where it is further aligned how this can be used, and we are expecting that the RFMBO Delegated Act will receive a technical review. So all the changes we will get for low carbon hydrogen will also be integrated in the RFMBO Delegated Act. This is also an opportunity to change the current approach. To sum it up, we currently see not a harmonized global market for e-fuels. Each region is defining the production rules for hydrogen and derivatives in a different way. We see that the strictest rules apply in the EU when it comes to additionality, especially about CO2 sources. The UK is more strict when it comes to temporal correlation, but has more flexibility in the use of subsidized or funded renewable electricity and also for CO2 sources. The US has a different approach, and I'm happy that David is from the US and can tell us more also about the latest changes on the Inflation Reduction Act. This approach is more a carrot than a stick, so it's more about incentivizing the production of hydrogen, but nevertheless, you have to meet certain production rules, which I hope I could give you a good overview how it look like, what the differences are, and what the similarities also are. Our recommendations would be first, and we are glad to see that the Commission is already conducting a study on the effectiveness of the delegated acts. So this has been mentioned in the presentation of the Clean Industrial Deal. It's good. I think this process should be accelerated. I think we cannot afford to wait until the official review in July 2028 to change the delegated act. We need to do it right now. Our recommendation for review would be a full exemptions of all production criteria until we have reached a certain production capacity, like, for example, the 6 gigawatt, which are mentioned in the European Hydrogen Strategy. This is something we wanted to achieve in 2024. And I think we will not harm anyone or any technology if we exempt the rules until we have reached that capacity. The former German minister Robert Habeck also proposed to postpone the additionality until 2035 and keep monthly correlation. We would be in line with that. We also are in favor of free allocation of e-fuels in refineries, and that would allow to produce more kerosene for the aviation instead of other e-fuels. And then when it comes to the CO2 sources, as already mentioned, we need to have a different approach. Effective carbon pricing does not work. We will never have the same CO2 price, for example, in Namibia than we have in the EU. So we need to take into account economic wealth and other criteria. And there will be process-related unavoidable industry emissions, which we should consider, which will also exist after 2041. In the end, it's also important on a global level to reach harmonize rules on production of hydrogen and e-fuel, because it makes it quite complicated if you have separated rules, separated definitions in key regions. With that, I'm finishing my presentation. I hope it was not too long. And I hope I could provide you with some interesting information. And I'm glad that David Sasiski from Infinium offered to give us an overview how it works in practice, because I'm just analyzing the documents, but in the end you have to fulfill all these requirements. With that, I'm handing over to you, and we are happy to listen to you.
Hi, great. Thank you, Tobias. It's a hard act to follow. There's certainly a lot of nuance and detail as you kind of unpack the policy. By way of background, David Ziski, I head up government affairs and policy at Infinium. We are a U.S. headquartered company developing internationally power to liquids or eFuels projects around the globe. My background, I have a PhD in chemistry, but 2 decades ago hung up my lab coat and principally worked on the policy and government affairs side. I will say, as it comes to eFuels policy, sometimes that PhD gets stressed in terms of unpacking the rules. There's a lot of nuances and details associated with things, but I think we can all take some comfort here in the context that if you look back just in the course of the last 3 to 4 years, eFuels policy started as a blue sky sort of idea. And then here we stand today of major markets, including the US, the UK, the EU, with all foundational policies built around standing up and helping accelerate an eFuels business. In my 2 decades of doing this, that is an amazing starting point to see policies move into play in this regards. I'll share some context for us in terms of as you think about like implementation of building projects using these policy elements. I think we can all appreciate that the policy aspects are an important contributor, especially as we think about early stage projects. To be able to both help with the bankability, help with the financing, and help standing up, if you will, the early production process. You know, as you move towards nth stage projects, you can appreciate the dynamics of the market shift as folks have, you know, the economies of scales, the experiences, and the like mind vis-a-vis in terms of the policy interfaces from that respect. If you look broadly across the markets here, there's kind of two camps to put some perspective in this. The US approach, obviously, historically, both on energy policy and what we see as it interfaces with eFuels in the context here that it's a carrot-driven model to put incentives in place to encourage production of eFuels. Those production of eFuels can be used both either domestically or international, so it's less about a mandate perspective of demanding it. It's more of encouraging that they get stood up, and in particular, the emphasis there is that they get stood up domestically in the United States, but open in terms of the end use of the product. And then that compares from the other side of the equation around the mandated approach that we see in the European theater, which obviously becomes an important draw. It's an important demand signal. It's a market creator and a demand signal to really establish a foothold in the need of these products. And so the mandates serve, I think, an important role to really kind of give that push through to ensure that you're creating that market foothold as part of this. And so within this ecosystem, you know, these variants of approach, I think there's a lot of synergy as you think about kind of the interface of the policies here. You know, as a producer, the things that you're asking is where are you siting your facility and where do the products go? I think it's fair to say that aviation fuels, road fuels, they're fungible products. It doesn't take much energy to move them into a market. And so as you think about it as a producer, you're asking about the questions of where can I site the facility optimally, and then where can I think about either domestic or internationally where the products otherwise go in that context. I will share our experiences at Infinium. We started our first commercial project called our Pathfinder project, which is sited in Corpus Christi, Texas. That facility has been operational since 2023. It's a smaller scale facility, notwithstanding. It was our first entree in terms of producing commercial quantities of eFuels, both servicing e-diesel market and then naphtha for chemical production. More recently, we announced FID of our second commercial scale facility called our Project Roadrunner. That's sited in West Texas. That facility is primarily producing or will produce eSAF when that comes in line here in a number of months. That being said, that facility is destined around offtake contracts with a number of European partners, including IAG, British Airways, to move that eSAF fuel into the European theater. And as you can appreciate, what went into sort of facilitating these early stage projects is weaving a combination of two factors as we look at the policy interface here, both navigating the renewable electricity criteria associated with the various policy interface aspects, and then also around the CO2 sourcing aspects of the requirements underpinning the policies. I will say, as you look towards kind of the European theater with respect to both those criteria, you can appreciate that the renewable electricity approaches, there are some variances between the EU and the UK. I will say the UK is by far more strict around the electricity sourcing. There's two aspects that are a little more challenging to kind of unpack. One is the additionality criteria in the UK is the most strict that we've seen around the globe. It requires that the renewable electricity facility starts up at the same time as your RFMBO facility or after, whereas in the EU, it provides a 3-year window prior to startup of your RFMBO facility. That requires a lot of coordination to be able to triangulate two development projects, renewables, and your RFMBO facility in that context. To say that it can be done, it just takes a lot more effort than having a cushion of 3 years, which provides a lot more breathing room, if you will, in terms of trying to align two different capital projects together to co-sync overall. Second, the UK has a 30-minute temporal interval compared to what we see in the EU at an hour, or in the phase-in at monthly, where we stand today. While technically there's not much differences between an hour and 30 minutes, it is still a narrower criteria to navigate. It also adds a lot more overhead in terms of accounting for fuels from a bookkeeping perspective. So it certainly provides more sort of effort, if you will, in terms of around the electricity criteria. The second, I guess the other part that I'll add, and Tobias mentioned it, the UK has opened up bridge vis-a-vis any subsidization or incentives around the renewable electricity. There's a lot of jurisdictions, the US is included, that often provide certain incentives broad-based towards the renewable industry, tax credits or otherwise, just as inherent in terms of their treatment of renewable electricity. The UK has not put any particular impediments in terms of subsidization around the renewable electricity. Obviously, in the EU, once the phase-in happens, that you can't have any subsidization. That's oftentimes just a barrier to put in place, that trying to finance a renewable electricity project in a jurisdiction that always operates with incentives, you become the odd child out trying to stand up a facility that's doing it different than everyone else. That provides that provides some barriers when someone looks to finance and stand up a new facility, that you're trying to do it the way that isn't normally done, and also coming with additional financial risk associated with it. And so it's just something to keep in mind. It hasn't affected us today because that hasn't been in play in terms of the EU, in terms of when it phases in here from a criteria perspective. On the CO2 side, that is by far one of the elements that we otherwise have faced from our early stage projects that really is dictating where our end products go. Our projects in the US, Project Roadrunner, is sourcing CO2 from industrial CO2 supply. There's a lot of reasons why we're sourcing CO2 from industrial, particularly at these early stage projects. It's available in the quantities you have. You're able to source your RFMBO facility close to the emitter, which also then has access to renewables in the local market. As you can appreciate, other sources of supplies like biogenic, as it pertains to the US, are at different spots in the country, hundreds of thousands of miles away. Trying to the logistics, just the physical logistics of moving biogenic CO2, either liquefying it, moving it by rail, or moving it by truck, add a pretty significant risk and complication in terms of being able to deliver CO2, and part of the challenge, which makes it an extra significant barrier to otherwise achieve, especially at these early stage projects where you really want to think about simple, easy, reducing risk in terms of the context of things. Flip side, DAC is not available. I think the last numbers that I've looked at, if you total up the amount of production of DAC that exists around the entirety of the world, our existing facility, Project Pathfinder, that we've been operating, if you had some ability to aggregate it, we could run that facility probably about 2 to 3 weeks total using all the world supply of DAC. And then as you move to Roadrunner, that will change to just a few days supply, again, around the world perspective. And then if you look towards where we're going in our third and fourth project, you'll be down to a matter of hours in terms of what the global supply is. It's just not available at the quantities you need, where the scale is of where eFuels perspective is. That being said, our projects are looking at industrial CO2. As you look towards the policy landscape, the UK is very favorable and doesn't put, other than standard sustainability requirements around ensuring that the CO2 is coming from a waste source, isn't intentional in terms of its production. That being said, where the blocker occurs in the European Union requires that the CO2 source is coming under an effective carbon pricing scheme. One does not exist in the United States, let alone in Texas, in this context. And so, as Tobias mentioned, it's a de facto ban in terms of the use of industrial RFMBOs produced from industrial sources outside of the European Union or the UK in this context. Our fuel supply from our Roadrunner facility is directed towards the UK market, primarily because of the fact that we can meet the requirements, in particular around the CO2 aspects and criteria, without having encumbered around a need for a carbon pricing scheme that the European Union otherwise provides. So I think you can appreciate through kind of the scope here, as you think about projects, it's intertwining a combination of the renewable electricity criteria, CO2 sourcing criteria, to be able to meet the criteria requirements to be able to access these policy instruments, such that you can otherwise establish a viable project and bring to market in this context. So hopefully this provides some insight, at least about how we've thought about things. I think also I'll just end on the final point here is we see these three markets. I think as we look towards the future in the next couple of years going ahead, fully anticipate there will be other geographies. You have Asia and other locations around the world that are also contemplating standing up similar incentives. It might add to, unfortunately, Tobias, it might add that matrix out and add an additional basis in that context, but certainly provides more opportunities to successfully kind of grow and stand up additional production of e-fuels.
Thanks a lot, David. Yeah, I'm sure more and more region will follow. There's already a question in the Q&A about China. I'm not aware of any production rules in China, but I think they are also more interested in producing for offtake markets, like, for example, the European Union. For that reason, they are keen on meeting these criteria. Last year, we had the meeting with the Japanese Minister for Economy, and they said that they won't follow the European approach, and that they will act more pragmatic as Japan as a country which also will depend on energy imports. I think if Europe is doing it too restrictive, the e-fuel amounts will go anywhere else where what your example is proving that the amounts are going to the UK instead of Europe at the moment. I guess it's also hard to explain this to investors, or because you not even have to explain the Inflation Reduction Act, which has seen some changes. Maybe you can also elaborate on this. But also the delegated acts and the rules in the countries where you want to sell the RFMBOs. How difficult is it to explain all of this to investors, and what experience have you made there?
It's certainly a focus of a lot of conversations to get investors comfortable with the policy instruments. It gets in the weeds, as our conversation here over the last 40 minutes have been in this context. I think on the US side, obviously we've all watched over the last number of weeks and months here some of the changes and tweaks that are occurring around the IRA incentives. I will say, through that process, things look pretty dire. I think where things otherwise have landed, we're certainly in a better shape of where they were trending. And I know a lot of eFuel Alliance members and others spent a lot of effort in advocacy efforts to kind of impact that outcome. That being said, I think what you see is a number of the transformative credits, like the hydrogen credit and some of the renewable energy incentives, have come back in terms of their phase out dates. They were originally set generally in the 2032 timeframe, have kind of been pulled forward into the end of 2027, 2028 arena. And so I think what was a very long-term policy stability in the US has now kind of moved back a little bit more into the more shorter medium term in terms of the timeline perspective in that regards as it pertains to the US. On the European side, I think a lot, as you look at, investors have been just trying to understand how you kind of navigate the rules and look for a project that has ability to meet the stated criteria associated with it. So it's a lot of education and walking through kind of the nuances and details, maybe at a level that investors typically don't have to kind of become experts around renewable electricity sourcing and some of the CO2 nuances that you see in other more traditional alternative fuels like biofuels, for example.
Thanks a lot. And I got it right that President Donald Trump has signed 5 days ago his big what is the name? Big Great Deal, or
One big beautiful bill, yes.
Big beautiful bill that you now have to get into operation until end of 2027. If you want to benefit from the tax incentives for green hydrogen. What does it mean? Do I have to start digging a hole, or what is the definition of start construction?
Yeah, so what changed in the course of the one big beautiful bill is moving the begin of construction date, which was originally at the end of allowed up to 2031, now to the end of 2027. There are several different mechanisms to establish a beginning construction. There's a spend. You have to spend 5% of the project total cost is the way to kind of mark that first begin, or the other way is to do work of a significant nature. So it's taking and performing some sort of project specific activity. You're building something, you're doing something of substance and consequence to sort of kick off that begin of construction marker. And then you got to make progress across the establishing the project. Can be up to usually about 4 years, potentially longer, to then finalize your project. So there's sort of specific steps outlined that what a developer will take to mark that begin of construction date.
Okay, that's good to know. We have quite some questions in the chat. The first one come from Jean-Baptiste Jarry. I think he's working for Safran. He is asking if nuclear power is possible in France because the carbon footprint of the electricity grid is below 18 gram CO2 per megajoule. I think this is not possible. You just don't have to meet additionality if you are below 18 grams CO2 per megajoule. So you still have to source renewable electricity via guarantees of origin or PPAs. You just don't need to make sure that the installation is not older than 36 months when your RFMBO facility comes into operation. But hydrogen via nuclear power would be part of the low carbon hydrogen delegated act, which got published yesterday evening. And of course, as eFuel Alliance, we are analyzing this as well, and we are also monitoring this because it could have impact, of course, if it's easier to produce blue or red hydrogen in comparison to green hydrogen. We try to map this and to coordinate this for our members. Then there is a question from Alexandre Stuber. He's asking me to elaborate on the idea of free allocation of e-fuels in refineries. So currently, I think it's best explained in the Q&A document of the RFMBO delegated acts, which are also linked in our comparison paper. Here it is said that there need to be a physical proof. So if you are producing different RFMBOs, for example, in a refinery or via Fischer-Tropsch, you might have some fractions for gasoline, diesel, kerosene, naphtha, and then the right mix has to be taken into account in the end. From a climate perspective, you could argue that the CO2 reduction matters in the end. So if I say my synthetic gasoline will be treated as fossil gasoline, but therefore I take this energetic share and add it on top for my synthetic kerosene, then from a climate perspective, it doesn't matter because the same CO2 emissions are reduced. And then I can steer my RFMBO production virtually to sectors where I might have a better market or more customers, for example. I know some companies who really would like to have something like this. And as long as we have different hydrocarbons which are in the market, I think it would help first movers to have a free allocation. So maybe in combination with a date until this option can be used would be a good idea. Another question before I hand over to my colleague Ralph for a wrap up is from Laurent Richard. I think this is the person who initiated our comparison paper. There he is asking how it is regulated or how it is proven that a country has a share of over 90% renewable electricity in the mix. If you have more than 90% renewable electricity in Europe, you don't have to show or demonstrate anything. Then all electricity input is considered as 0 gram CO2. And yeah, for that reason, I think in the delegated acts there's an annex where the electricity or the carbon intensity and the electricity shares are mentioned. So if you can show that the country where you are producing RFMBOs is in that list and is above 90%, you are exempted from the further criteria of RFMBO production. Yeah, these are the open questions we had in the chat. I don't know, David, if you would like to add something here.
Just on that last question for 90%, I think both in the Q&A there is a description of how you prove if it's 90%. There's a methodology the commission has laid out on that basis. And then it once you show that, you have a certain time window before you have to re-show it again in case the landscape otherwise changed. But then that's laid out there in terms of the criteria. And it's also in the body certification, they lay out how one goes about does it from a nuts and bolts calculation perspective.
I've also received an internal question from a colleague from the eFuel Alliance. He is writing to you, David. One argument for the strict rules of the EU concerning industry CO2 sources is to avoid lock-in effects, which would hinder the goal of climate neutrality by maintaining industry point sources for the usage of their CO2 emissions. What do you say to that?
Broadly, what we had heard from the commission, I think there was kind of two angles. One, originally we thought it was more of a financial level playing field in this context, right? Like EU cited projects has the ETS, obviously an international project potentially isn't subjected. And so you kind of have a financially an on-level playing field. But the messages that we've heard, and if others have heard differently, please reach out to me. It's more around a carbon leakage effect consideration, so more of a climate sort of perspective on that basis. That being said, the practical aspects of, there are very limited amount of carbon sources under carbon pricing, effective carbon pricing scheme. It's really UK, EU, and Switzerland, which obviously follows the EU bloc from a carbon perspective. And so, unfortunately, the result has been just an impossibility, a ban, if you will, for producing with effective carbon pricing. But that's at least what we've heard from the perspective of why that criteria is there. I will say it's fair to say that having this policy requirement, if you will, effective carbon pricing, is not found in any other LCA methodology or policy implementation around the globe. So EU is very much unique in this aspect, and it's certainly one that we've very much have struggled with how to find some way to work with this requirement.
Thanks a lot, David. And with that, I'm handing over to my lovely colleague, boss, and mentor, Ralph Diemer, for a wrap-up of today's webinar. Thank you, David, again, and thanks to all of you for the participation.
I never get these kind of compliments from Tobias usually, so that is a big day for me today. Just one note to your last bit. I assume the typical leading commission servant would expect, for example, the United States to invent a pricing system to collaborate better with the European Union. Unfortunately, the times where the world is following principally European rules is over, or at least it's not automatically the case anymore. Therefore, I think it's clear that this has to be changed. It's just not right to regulate in that manner, because it's basically a ban, an import ban from certain fuels, which we actually want because ESA, for example, is something we want very much in the European. When we started out 4 years ago in the eFuel Alliance, it was barely possible to do such an event where we compare regulatory schemes in different markets and countries, because simply there were none. We started our work, it was basically a European subject, and then the Inflation Reduction Act came up. All of a sudden, it started to be a very US, American, and also Canadian subject. Then we have a Japanese eFuel strategy, a country which we didn't include into this event yet. And see many other places of the world, interesting developments concerning the DT production and also the usage of alternative fuels in general, and in particular also eFuels. I think that this message itself is a very good one, because that shows that developments are really going forward. And that also helps us in our work, because if we have other examples in other markets, which might be better than the European ones, then we can also bring that forward to European officials and tell them best practice examples also from other countries, which would then, of course, also help. The second remark I would like to make, and that is, of course, Infinium, a very good example, but not the only example we have in the membership of the eFuel Alliance. It truly is a global business we are talking about. So it doesn't matter the size of the company, be it a smaller or even a startup, or be it a big oil company who is involved in this business. Everybody thinks globally, where are the best places to produce, where are potential users, and it basically doesn't really matter where. If you find that what you need, then you do it, and that is also, I think, a very important message, especially to sometimes European politicians who think this business is and should be only, so to speak, in a European one. I'd like to thank you all very much, especially, of course, David, for contributing once again. Thank you for Tobias and the team for doing this paper, also for the idea to bring that forward. I think it's a very interesting piece of inner work we did in the eFuel Alliance. We tend to do that as much as possible and as much as we can. And in addition to that, I would like to invite everybody, if you are not confirmed yet, if you might be in Brussels next Tuesday, there's our General Assembly at evening, our traditional summer reception. Please, if you are in Brussels or if you're able to make it to Brussels, come over and join us. We would highly appreciate that. And in the next future, we will see some more events on international and global developments, regulatory developments in the field of eFuels. The name China felt already a very interesting developments we see also there, and we will look into that and bring forward this in other webinars in the future. Thank you all. Thank you, the team. Thank you, Jan, for hosting this, and thank you for all the listeners who asked questions and listened again and were our guests once more. Have a beautiful day. It's getting warmer again, at least in Europe, after a short period of rain. Enjoy the rest of the week, and if we might not see each other before that, enjoy the summer as well. Have a good day. Bye.